forward to sharing with you a lot of things. First of all, thank you for attending this seminar. Our thanks also to TIPA and for allowing us to be here today, because this makes the energy flow towards a common goal or a common idea that is always fruitful. Without each of you, this round table called All for One and One for All, and the cross-functional and the ability to leverage the museum experience, I think that it will allow us to share the energy, the experiences, and the conversations all together make what's most relevant for our context. I am the panel moderator, so I will ask you some questions so that we start building a kind of understanding that may lead to a question that has different answers. How cross-functionality help us to reimagine the museum? And we will think along this line, and also during the afternoon session that is about the big manifesto. What are the barriers, drawbacks that we need to overcome in this context? And does cross-functionality look like in discipline? And I encourage you to think in different ideas or notions and listen to our speakers. Karen Wilkinson from the Tinkering Studio, the Exploratorium, Andrés Roldán from Parque Explora, and Karen Bernedo Morales from the Traveling Cultural Museum for the Memory. Some triggering ideas. And when I got in contact with you, there was a kind of explosion of energy, new ideas, new questions, and I guess that you are looking forward to listening to these presenters or speakers, and also to listening to your own contexts. So it's like a small or tiny seed that is constantly in contact with the air, water, earth, and everything intertwines. So let's focus on the context, the relevance of the context. Interdisciplinary or cross-functionality has a connection with what's not visible. That is to say, connections, what brings us closer, the loving, and go unnoticed in our day-to-day and in contemporaneity. The other thing that I would like to share with you is this impulse of doing, like an explosion, an interplay, discovery, and a manifesto. The connection between the body or the hand and the mind and the thoughts, it's immediate, intense, mysterious, and transforming. The flexibility and the transformation of interdisciplinary, well, I think that somehow, or to a smaller or larger extent, we do project this. The interdisciplinary space, the lab or the meeting point or the studio. Gabriel Orozco describes this space, the studio not as a production space, but as a time to know ourselves. The availability or the spirit of state for the transformation of communication. If we are here, it's because we are on the same mood. And then three other items to ask questions. Some months ago, I had the opportunity, thanks to TIPA and AAM, to visit Atlanta together with some of their members to discuss in a different context about interdisciplinary and some challenges. And what impressed me was something that I got back from TIPA, and TIPA underscored these. That is to say that the challenge of interdisciplinary projects is complex, and complex in Portuguese sounds different, but the cross-functional or interdisciplinary projects are complex, and it involves different people, subjects, different stages. It sounds obvious, but actually, I invite you to think that is time-consuming, that we have to be present, we have to challenge ourselves to be present at more than one stage, and that involves a lot of energy. And to wrap up, and to invite you to trigger some questions to my three panel members. This is an example of an art works from the Elchin collection. And this workpiece is like a metaphor, or a door, or a seed, as I have just said. The Neo-Ching Institute is located in Brazil, in the city of Brumadinho, Minas Gerais. It's not a big city. It's a middle-sized city, but this institute is, to me, a laboratory where we explore and develop over the past 10 years different ideas or notions about cross-functionality of what we do and the poetic, political, and critical role of education. And this is María Ardo's workpiece, and you can see it on the screen. So we can focus on what it transforms, what dies and what grows, what is in between being born and dying, the childhood spirit, and you can see this better on this slide, what I mean, the different process stages. And I was telling Karen that what's interesting about this workspace, this is at her place, and the artist invites us to participate, to get involved. Many contemporary art pieces encourage us to do this. So this slide, because I got in contact with the experiences of the three panel members, and I remember this artist, and what I like about her is that the art works is an open ending and invites people to participate. I want to grow, I want to seed something, and when we see a child or an older person or a whole family, a school that sees what has already been seeded or planted and is dying, and or that we need to weed it out, and it's about this. Or the contrary, when you check that the plant or something is already dead, you clean it out and start all over again. And it's here where we can think about memory, childhood, knowledge, play, game, and many other things. So, María Ardo's, and the name of the art piece is The Origin. And For me, it's a phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of the Pachamama, the mysterious energy that makes us move, and an energy that Marcel Duchamp also mentions. When we talk about the art of creating, Duchamp makes reference to the artistic coefficient, or that gap, or the space existing between what we do and our intentions as artists, as audiences, as creators, and also what we see as artists and audiences. So it is in this gap that we can put whatever we want. Everything is under construction. The senses are on the alert. The invisible can be present, and cross-functionality or interdisciplinary appears. So I give the floor now to Karen Wilkinson from the Tinkering Studio, the Exploratorium, and I will ask her a question.
Karen, can you tell us more about the way you see curation? Not as curating with objects, but instead curating ideas and the ideas of visitors in particular.
Great, yeah. Hi, so thank you for having me be a part of this panel. And I especially want to also thank AAM and TIPA. Juana Torino actually came to the Exploratorium a few years ago and spent several months there talking to us about things that were happening in Argentina. And this is my first time to visit. So I was very excited from the things that she told me to anticipate, but also getting to connect with many of you in workshops and the four of us about this panel. So in order to answer that question, I think it's probably best to give you a little bit of a sense of where I come from and why I feel like the theme for this conference and this session, so reimagining the museum and also this all-for-one, one-for-all approach, really resonates with me quite a bit. And I think the Exploratorium was founded by a visionary scientist, thinker and human being, Frank Oppenheimer, in 1969. He's pictured in the photo there. And I feel like at the time he was reimagining the museum back then and what a museum really could be. I think there are kind of the spirit of reinvention and kind of reimagining is really still alive today. And we've actually just recently changed locations. So the photo that you see on your upper left is of the Palace of Fine Arts. That's where we spent 40 years, 40 plus, 43, I think, years after our founding. And the image below that shows Frank taking ownership, essentially, shaking the mayor's hand on the first day we took occupancy back in '69. So that's actually what the building looked like on the inside. And then below Frank's picture, you see a sign that was a really symbolic sign. It was handmade and hung in our shop, the machine shop. And it says, "Here is being created, the Exploratorium, a community dedicated to awareness." And to us, those words were profound back then and continue to be. So in moving to the new museum, this is where we are now. We've moved to a more modern and urban location, and we took those words on that old sign and etched them permanently into the building. So the doors to the main entrance now say those very things. And to us, that sense of creating awareness as a community, both internally and the community that we're a part of, is really important. We took over a new location, but an old building again, so there were some familiar things about moving into this new space. It was very warehouse-like. Again, now you see the picture below. That's the new space. It was empty when we first got it. And we moved in 2 years ago. So we've filled it up over time, and it occupies 2 piers along the city's waterfront. Will you guys tell me? I have a tendency to speak fast. So in my notes, it says slow down. So will you just tell me if I'm Just for interpreting, I want to make sure I'm not speaking too fast.
No, it's perfect.
Okay. So I don't know, I would say we're still getting to know our home, even though we've been there for 2 years, and we're really trying to continue to hack it as a space. The picture on the top here shows from one of our opening celebrations, a group called Obscura Digital created a projection, a live projection. They were showing things physically changing, dropping liquids and moving things physically, but also projecting it up onto the building as part of the opening ceremonies. And once again, we've filled a building or continue to fill it with experiences to engage people in science, art, and human perception. One of the new initiatives in the building, one of 4 new initiatives, is the Tinkering Initiative, and that's the one that I'm most closely connected to and will speak about today. It grew into prominence in the new museum. It was a proof of concept in a tiny little corner in the back of the old building, but is now very much front and center when you first enter. So I feel like it's a logical outgrowth that it happened at the Exploratorium because tinkering, this active doing and making, has been, we say it's a part of our DNA. It's a part of what we've done all along. But the switch here, the intentional switch, is that we wanted to involve visitors in that making and doing. So I'll share some ideas specific to tinkering and hopefully ask a few provocative questions about what it means to kind of reimagine your museum from the inside out, because I feel like that's the way it's worked in our case. So 4 kind of big ideas, I think, relate to this session. And this is one of them. So this is a weird word. It's a word that comes from constructivism with a V instead of construction with a T. And that's a learning theory that asserts that we build our knowledge through experiences, direct experiences with stuff, and sharing those experiences with others. Jean Piaget is the social psychologist who coined that theory, but a student of his and a mentor of mine, Seymour Papert, twisted that phrase to turn it to constructionism, which meant believing in constructivism, but going a step further to say, when you build objects, when you physically make something, something different happens. It's a more durable way of learning and thinking about things. And that really important part about sharing that construction with other people. So it's the constructing and the sharing that's important. And in the tinkering studio, this means exhibits and activities that people are physically constructing and making things. So in this photo, you see a workshop going on in the tinkering studio where we're building electric tiaras. So people are thinking about circuits, constructing with wire. It's playful. They're learning how to solder, so skill building. And it's very social. A lot of the people around the table or in the room when this is going on, out in the exhibit hall, they're unfamiliar to each other. They don't know each other when they first arrive. That changes by the time that they leave. And the construction that I'm talking about, in this case, well, here, it's a different activity, also ringing the tinkering studio. It's called marble machines. And in this case, it's physical construction, but it's not just physical. Sometimes this constructing can take a digital form, analog, computational, but always kind of with a playful and even sometimes slightly subversive spirit. We see tinkering as a marriage of play and inquiry, both. And it's really about learning a new type of language, one of constructing with materials and phenomena, or learning to converse with them, rather. The tinkering studio offerings, they're intrinsically motivated. This is probably the easiest sell. People are compelled and they want to work together on these things. They want to try, and once they get started, even if they're a little shy in the beginning, it's very hard to stop them once they get going. This is a good thing. They tend to dwell for a really long time, much longer than other parts of the museum. The average time spent in the tinkering studio is about 25 minutes, and some people stay much longer, several hours, and often repeat their visits, purchasing memberships specifically for participating in the tinkering studio. So here's another, one of the big four. So science and art, the interdisciplinary topic that we're talking about in this session. We feel like art is such an essential part of the Exploratorium, you can't talk about it without including the arts. I feel like, to us, people think of us primarily as a science museum, but we're more than that. We think of ourselves as science, art, and human perception. And Frank was so attuned to this aesthetic aspect. He was formerly trained as a physicist, so a deep love of science, but he also felt like artists and scientists were incredible noticers, seekers of patterns, and that was a habit or a disposition to cultivate in others. And another thing he loved pointing out, that I do too until this day, is that there are things built on the floor, built by scientists and artists, but they're not labeled that way. So things built by a physicist or an artist, and you can't tell which is which often. And I think this blurring of boundary lines is really key, and it's also key in a trend that we've seen in the tinkering studio, especially of an interest in more engagement in women and girls, something that's really important to me. Also in staff, too. I would just say visitors and staff as well. Something that people on the outside notice about some of the work happening in the tinkering studio, and I would say even the Exploratorium here as well, is this sense of humor and whimsy. So I include this photo. This is a piece that's a meter and a half, mad at meters, taller than I am, and wider. It's entirely built of toothpicks and glue. And the person who, it's a man now, but he started this construction when he was 14 years old. And it's a sculpture, an homage to the city of San Francisco, that you roll ping pong balls down. So it takes 7 tours of the city. And I would just encourage you, Google Scott Weaver, or actually no, Google toothpicks and Exploratorium, and you can see a movie of it. So Scott Weaver, I like it because he's a resident of the local area. He works in a grocery store, and this was his passion, his side passion. Now he spends many days at the museum working on this, and it continues to grow. But a playful use of materials. We think of ourselves as a learning lab. The most obvious way we emphasize this part of learning is that we emphasize process. And process never ends. You don't learn something and then it's done. It's not a terminal, fixed, kind of finite thing. We're engaging in the process of making things, objects, but it is that process that we care most about. We host artists, educators, and scientists in residence with us, both to learn from their process, but also to have our visitors rub elbows and learn that the work that they're engaged in together is also a process and not a finished piece. We don't curate finished work. We're really about the developing of ideas together. And I think we also see ourselves as researchers and practitioners. So we use our floor as a prototyping space, an active, changing prototyping space. Okay, thanks. And we're not trying to teach people what to think. We're really trying to get them to think for themselves. We're really keenly interested in learning how to learn. I'm going to skip. I've been given my sign. I'm a little bit behind. I'm going to skip a couple of slides and end with this one. We offer professional development work around the country, but something that we've done very recently is to create a MOOC, a massively open online course. And it's a way of connecting with people that I was really uncertain about initially. And we've had over 10,000 people participating. And I have to say, I have completely changed my assessment of how I thought this was going to work as a medium. I feel, as I'm participating in this kind of larger community, I feel so connected to everyone in terms of the concerns and the issues that we all face, but also that I'm in it, I'm participating in something much larger than myself. And then I will end with this. So this is my email. If something I've said resonated with you or you'd like to stay in contact, please do that. And then the URL at the bottom is for the Tinkering Studio. We have a blog where we're actively posting on things, about things that we're doing. And we posted one just last night about the conference. So thanks.
Thank you very much.
I recommend you to see the MOOC, and we feel very close to the team, and we take advantage of that platform. Andrés? Hello, how are you doing? I have a question. Do we provoke indiscipline of many people and concepts through interdisciplinary and collaborative projects? Medellin in the 80s and 90s, as you may have some references, Medellin, well, was under a lot of scourges through drug trafficking and a war that we are still looking forward to the ending or the outcome, and a long history of inequality, social exclusion, isolation. The place where I work, Parque Explora, is located in an area that 10 years ago was next to the local dumpster. And when the dumpster was closed, well, the vegetation covered the whole area, and thousands of farmers displaced by violence and many other different reasons found a nice little green hill in the middle of the city, and it promised to be a strategic place for their new homes. Well, but it was a dumpster, and it grew in a disorganized fashion where misery was all over, and it fell into oblivion on the part of the society, the government. Nobody, or basically everybody, turned a blind eye to that place. But it was so evident that the new political proposals approach it, and in a way, in order to transform the city. Well, after the different dictators or drug traffickers as Pablo Escobar, most of us as Colombians don't like to talk about them, but it's part of our history. So this was the way the society organized itself, generating a lot of problems, and the solution was not going to come from the outside, and all the problems were not going to be solved with a lot of police officers, but it implied a deep social transformation. So the transformation unfolded through different strategies, and my museum is part of that strategy. We turned the most vulnerable places in the city, the most abandoned places by this, the government, should create scenarios or stages and that would allow us to forget the past, and that would not display sad future. When I graduated from the university, I didn't want to live in the city because the notion of the future was very looming. But as a result of that, the best architects, the best designers put a lot of effort together in order to create the best tools to dignify our spirit and change the tone of the conversation. And Parque Explora is the outcome of that decision. One of the mayors build libraries and parks, and that's why we decided to build the Science Museum. My impression of this museum is that it was a museum that was sketched on a napkin, and I decided myself I have to be part of that as well as my colleagues. So we built Explora by doing, that is to say, facing or by tinkering actually, and asking ourselves, how are we going to do things completely different? How are we going to build this through science and technology? And that is where the first lesson comes, science and technology. There are other art, history, as you mentioned, but science and technology are also social transforming tools. It's not just tools used by scientists in laboratories, but they enable real transformation as individuals, as a society. So our mission is to inspire, to communicate and transform using different interactive scenarios for the transformation of the society through knowledge appropriation and through knowledge transformation. And by doing, we are transformed. And so the typical procedure is to engage a well-known architect firm to build the museum, but we decided to create a working atmosphere where we would build the project. And we were fortunate enough that we started from scratch. And we generated this conversation atmosphere, and that was the second selection, what we called design by conversation. That is to say, this transforming environmental context was built by an ongoing conversation, including designers, architects, communicators, architects, etc. The happiest moment in my life was when we decided to live together under the same roof for 3-4 years, 50 people in a house, including architects, scientists, communicators, and we designed or developed the vision of the project. And this was a far-reaching project. It took us 3 years to design it, and like a turnkey project, we had only 3 years. That is to say, creating both the museum or the building and the art at the same time. And that was the DNA that transformed us as an organization. And also we realized that the talent was not the museum itself as the visiting place, but what happens or what's going on in the museum, in this ongoing creation process of thinking new situations, creating new conversations, and create new things altogether. So now we have a lot of exhibitions, and we build different museums, planetariums in other places, interactive institutions, different learning innovation studios. And this is not part of Explora. It's our different projects with different partners. This is a tinkering, and the bottom of the slide. Now there is a very big project in Antioquia where we are building 80 educational spaces in the faraway communities that are part of victims of the war and oblivion. for the conversion and education of these villages. And finally, we realized that our mission is to design innovating learning environments. So it's not just about talking about astronomy or a different subject matter. What is part of our DNA of Explora as an organization is that any contact is an opportunity to start a conversation, to start designing and creating context with the appropriate tools. And this is our cornerstone, the addition of good content plus mediation and the best conversation in the appropriate context makes the experience for the visitors, like in the tinkering, the design of a new exhibition, or the development of a new museum. If all these things, or three things, are interconnected, well, we are successful. And this is our type of conversation. Most of the times we start our communication with the community. We get the initiatives from the community, activists, NGOs that are provoking our minds. And this is just one example. For example, we found that there were many groups that were concerned about creating alternative communication media. So we said, there's something going on here, and we created a tinkering studio on audiovisual images or content. And the idea is that the audience is the experience and not the object. So you are the TV producer, you are the politician, you are the radio programmer, and that is the experience. And it's about the experience. And this is only possible in the context of a very large conversation. There are many disciplines missing in this slide and many other stakeholders, but in this conversation process with the communities, designers, content developers, it's an experience that produces the same what you are doing in the design process itself. That is to say, the creative part of a museum that is only received by the visitor is not our mission. What happens in the design team should also go through the visitors. That is to say, these tinkerers. We want audiences to be tinkerers themselves. So our conversations make that the creative management of the projects, including decision makers that think that they are not creative, but to make them get involved through the very early stages of the conversation. And the final metaphor of the project is that you deliver those projects. For example, like this theater that became an exhibition hall where everything takes place. So we try to get the best of the human relationship in the exhibit hall, and that is through the interactivity, and that is what happens with the tinkerers. It's not about the object, but what you create. You build or assemble or develop, innovate, and get to different results. The sensory motor part and prioritize this idea of the visitors building. And it's not just for science, but for any other field where people build, design, and do themselves. Also, the social component is included, where the audience interact and create a human experience, and we prioritize those experiences. So what you see on this slide is an ongoing or continuous laboratory where we like to build, design things, and this designing and constructing that the museum does is the most valuable asset, because it is the museum, the one that has the vision and that has education needs, where it is necessary to appropriate that museum. And my final conclusion or takeaway is that museums in the past were defined on the basis of their collections, the different cases. Well, those were the first type of museums. Then the museums were defined by the buildings in emblematic locations of the cities to show off and to draw audience. But the future and today's reality indicate that it's about the communities that define the museums and that make the museum conversations. The museum is only one of the strategies that as an organization we have to share outside that community management that we need to work with. Thank you very much. We turn it over now to Karen Bernedo, and the question is already raised for our discussion, for our prior discussion, for a museum, that has already been reimagined. Tell us what process you underwent. So thank you very much for inviting me, and my thanks to the organization for inviting me and for your time to be here and to share with my panel members their wonderful experience that help us reimagine the museum. And this poses a challenge as well. So, answering María Eugenia's question, and given the name of the project, we have some clues about my presentation and the topic of the project, that is about memories associated to the museum nature. It's a traveling museum, a museum that has no specific place. So how can we create a memory museum in a country where there is no memory at all? Because in the future we will have the inauguration of a museum remembering intolerance and lack of memory, but anyway. This is a complex issue in terms of museum points of view and ideological points of view, because the memory process, the civil war in Peru in the 80s and in the 90s is complex, brought up polarization, there is no consensus, there is no official version by the state yet. So it is very complex. It is a cross-functional project, and it's an intercultural project from a museum point of view. So we decided to build a museum as an excuse, as a pretext, and I pick on Oscar's last statement. Andrés, she corrected herself. A museum that is an excuse, that the purpose is not the heritage or the collection or the object, but to generate a social space, to trigger critical reflection, dissent, consent, dialogue about something that we don't want to talk too much in Peru. And although there was a commission of the truth and there was a president that was incarcerated for a breach of human rights, the post-conflict stage, society is undergoing this process of assimilating and looking at the consequences and these outstanding that are make us Peru being a country that is not fully developed. So we are activists of human rights movements, and this is an interdisciplinary approach. We include anthropologists, visual anthropologists in my case, lawyers, activists, but we are heavily involved in human rights movements, and we were always looking to ourselves. All the memory activities, well, we all agree on them. We believe that we could change the world, and we were very cool about that. But then you were faced with reality And in Peru, for example, the impression or the feeling is that breaches to human rights were acceptable in for the sake of pacification. So, based on yesterday's presentation, the idea was to create a museum for the benefit of the people. So this is like a transformer. The museum is a transformer. It has no museum icons, well-defined or well-defined structure. It adjusts to the context where it goes. It can be a scaffolding, a park, the street, the courtyard of a school, church, and it's an ongoing challenge to reinvent ourselves. Each assembly required a different assembly and a different approach, and sensitivity to the different communities and spaces. This is a memory museum. It doesn't include historical data. Elizabeth Jelly, an Argentine thinker, a very smart thinker, and those that are involved in memory, we learned from her a lot. So she says that memory museums, including historical data, should be called history museums. But we are a memory museum because we collect symbolic pieces of art by artists, victims, family members. And these are recollections or memories of the Civil War. And it's difficult to install a national memory or a single story of what happened. But the different aspects include local stories that don't fade away in the national story. So we have, for example, a story that tells the story of a displaced family. It's a dialogue of memories and techniques and different contexts. For example, traditional pieces of art, as you can see on this slide. And this is very important because the armed conflict in Peru, well, was different in different parts, and it's not the same to go through in the 80s or to have lived in Lima in the 80s, for example. And we would remember, for example, blackouts or the disappearance or the missing of people or kidnappings. So it's a dialogue of different memories that coexist in the same timeline, but it's very interesting to put it in different perspectives.
These memories are not focused on horror, on tragedy or pain, but many deal with resistance. Many of these works of art were built by communities. They are negotiated memories. And that's also interesting, the diversity that could be portrayed when dealing with a subject matter. Another challenge is to have a different approach to curatorship. We always work within a context. We may have exhibitions, theme exhibitions. If we go to a community, we can receive objects from the community. On August the 5th, that was the day where a coup was staged against Fujimori. We can also show memory as it is built, as it develops, and that memory is in constant reformulation and change. Another major challenge of this project is to connect cultural production to life. That's the main thing about a traveling museum. We see people who walk by and enter into our museums, and probably that's not the typical audience that visits museums. We used to take an object that was an altar built by families, and in Andean communities, they didn't see this as a museum object, but rather they left, for example, photographs there. And they said, we are poor, justice never reaches us, but we want to have our photos included in that altar, since it's a traveling museum. So some of the objects of the museum, well, are objects with which the communities have a special connection. Same thing with the names that you can see, and maybe some families queue for 5 hours in order to leave a flower to their dead relative. And they leave it here in our traveling museum, where there's no corpse, there's no the family member they have lost is not there, but still they feel that connection. So a museum can represent the sense and the feelings of a city. Throughout the city, for example, we mark locations that are not visible, but those are places where human rights were infringed and violations took place. And this is the only project that we have right now, which has to do with historic memory, and it is the more controversial when we take it to the parks or squares. There's nothing to be interpreted here, but it is in this project where you can see polarization, conflict, dissidence. And this is a maze, like a timeline of the armed conflict in Peru. This is where people start discussing and reflection arises. This is an example that memories are complex when it comes to human rights. This came from the armed forces and subversive groups, Sendero Luminoso and the RTA. So there's some work that was created by police officers, because they were also the victims in some occasions. So this helps us bring down the dilemma, victim and aggressor, for example. This work of art was created by the first association of family members of the victims, and they incorporate the faces of different women. In this piece, for example, there's 150 faces. They always have their pictures taken, and they want their faces to be included in that object, in that work of art. We always try to have exchange workshops, guided tours, to challenge the way in which education is thought, interdisciplinary nature within a museum that has no walls and no defined boundaries. And also, there's a political project. This is a current topic where we see pending issues through demonstrations. And we also try to be present there. With this, I'm going to close my conversation, but I wanted to tell you that this project is self-standing. It is possible thanks to the collaboration of volunteers, NGOs, the contributions of civil society members. We started working with this, and we got funding from volunteers, because when the crisis hit the world, there was no more funds available for arts-related projects. So this is how we started finding our way to move on. Thank you.
Gracias a los tres.
Thank you. I wanted to tell you something. Some years ago, I came to Buenos Aires. I was invited to come. And at that time, I said that drawing, I'm going to say this in Portuguese. Otherwise, it will take me too long. Drawing is a risk because in Portuguese, the same word is used for risk and for drawing. So that's my invitation for you to engage in this risk and to draw. Please raise your hands if you want to ask questions. There's somebody here? Okay. I wanted to ask a question about the traveling museum to Karen. What do you do with objects once the exhibition is over? Because there's no physical location or building or warehouse to store them in. Oh, well, many of these objects are graphic arts replications. We keep them, but sometimes we give them back to the original artists once the exhibition is over. Hello. Thank you very much for the risk you have taken. I wanted to make a brief comment and a question to the three of you. I think that reimagining museums somehow is about thinking interdisciplinary or interdisciplines through the creative process. It's about understanding the grammar of creation. I think that pedagogy and educational processes in museums are very much focused on mediation rather than working from the grammar of creation. What do I mean by this? And I think that the three cases are trying to address this issue. We understand grammar as the organization of perception and experience, and that's where the nerve structure of the conscience gets in communication with itself and with other consciences. With the interdiscipline, going back to Garcia Canclini's introduction, and this is my question, how can we think about interdiscipline as a creative act? We're bringing together disciplines. It's not going to show us the best way to work, but rather the idea is to incorporate from each discipline an element, for example, the approach, the method for constructing a work. So how do we deal with interdiscipline from the different processes to build culture and to address culture? So my question is, how do we address from these permanent creative processes this construction from different knowledges and perceptions of the world that can enter into dialogue simultaneously and in the same space? I don't know if I quite understood the question, but I'll make my best to answer it. I think that the creative act is contained. It's not an invisible process that is out there and that we get a result from that. I think that every person is creative, every one of us. And there's damage when we engage in interdiscipline, when we think that designers design nicely and scientists know about content. At least in the projects where I've worked, that's not how a collective work is carried out. It is built by fabricating or creating the means and the conditions to allow everybody to participate. These tools allow us to weave a final outcome that can be translated into a 25-minute experience at the Exploratorium by building robots or within a museum or an institution. It seems something out of common sense, seems something logical, but that's not the common thing. Usually the architect designed the structure, designers come later, those who are going to live the experience come later, so there's no communication in the process. One of our major challenges, and I think that the 3 or 4 cases present here today, is that the experience of creating is the content itself. So how can we curate experiences? How can we collect means of thinking and not just objects? It is okay to collect objects, but how do you collect the relationship with your audience? So when you get a phone call, it's not that they tell you, well, since you are so creative, but rather, why don't we work together on something? Good ideas are promiscuous in nature. So what you have to do is to create the right environment for them to happen. Your question was very interesting. In the case of the traveling museum, when we thought about the project, we had in mind a discussion that took place in the 70s in Peru. I don't know if you know what a retablo is. It's a very traditional piece of work in Peru. He got an award. It's an altar piece. So the more traditional plastic arts or fine arts artists put together a manifesto, and they said this is not art, it's handcrafts. And this was maintained for some time, this conflict between fine arts and handicrafts or crafts. I think that it was a political stance that we took when we placed the name art. It's different ways of understanding and materializing memories. Sometimes we are not even able to understand them based on where we come. For example, the pain that comes from missing your own land. Once I was with a composer and I asked him to teach me songs. Those songs, I couldn't understand them. They were all written about the age of violence in Peru, but I couldn't grasp the meaning. That's why perspective is so...
We only have a few minutes left, but to me, viewing things in an interdisciplinary way is absolutely essential. I think part of the human experience of coming to understand things is through a variety of disciplines, and it's that intentional shift from seeing things anew, from a different perspective, that grounds the experience and makes it more holistic for everyone, but also makes it really real and meaningful for individuals.
We have time for just one more question. Andrés, the question is for you. It's clear, kind of clear, how the creative process works, but I'm interested in knowing the strategies that you devise in terms of your relationship with the community, because you propose this change for the city, in particular for the Explora Park, but the community that was hit by the violence, and And were you able to measure over time throughout the development of Explora the impact? Of course, that was a major challenge because we were not aliens arriving with our spaceship and, well, it's the same. For example, things are very bad here, so we don't care if you come from the outer space. So the challenge was, even before the design, was to create different strategies to analyze what would happen within the museum, but in that community. So I feel very proud today to say that out of many strategies, there were two that we underscored. First of all, that we decided to develop a urban agriculture project. That is to say, through the farming or the agriculture, we were able to transform the community, developing a dialogue or a conversation, and we started with very simple workshops. Moms would come and try things out, and through that urban agriculture process today, it's an agribusiness that is installed in the dumpster, and it's made up of a family or women that migrated from the different municipalities. So we didn't have too many expectations from the onset. We didn't say we are going to mount this agribusiness from the onset. No. Let's say we were going to open opportunities, and when you start building on the relationship, one step takes you to the other step, and so on. And the second example is a beautiful experience. Many moms, because we are talking about moms and most the family makeup is made up of moms and children. Men almost don't exist. So we collected different painful stories about their arrival to the city. And we were opening dialogues and conversations. We are going to create something together. And what are we going to talk about? We are going to talk about you, and we are going to create this with you. And initially, we were a large group of moms, and we turned those stories in Sherazade story, a soap opera. And the graphic context was the place where they live, their community. So we would create the atmosphere that the moms had in their places, and we had a photograph exhibition, but they were like tales, beautiful tales, and this made them feel very proud in the community. And this is another example of how you can open the dialogue or the conversation with the community.